Well, good morning. We're opening up the room now, so we'll give you a couple of minutes to get in, and then we'll start our session. So get comfortable, get a nice seat, and we'll get started in just a couple more minutes. Steve, would you mind making me an organizer so I can see the questions and also the attendees? Well, I think we'll get started now. We'll have more people entering the room over the next few minutes, but good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which part of the world you're in. I'm Lloyd Rankin, the head of the North American Advanced Work Packaging Community of Practice, and we now have communities of practice in North America, in Europe, in South America, in Russia, and we are in the process of opening up new communities of practice in the Middle East and in Asia. So the group is getting bigger, and we've got global participation, which is always great. This is the North American Community of Practice, and you'll notice that there is a currently 1,772 members, which is pretty much double what we had last year at this time. And you'll also notice an Invite Connections button. Once you're a member of the Community of Practice, you can invite your peers and your connections to also become members of the Community of Practice. And this is great because we have so much information that's coming up. I think it's a great opportunity to make your friends aware of what's happening. We also will be posting immediately after this session a list of the next 14 webinars that'll be happening over the next 6 months. So please get engaged, get involved, and let me just talk about the part of the reason that we're doing this session. CII is putting on a virtual summit on contract strategy, and it addresses both traditional and collaborative contracting. Two of the presenters for that session, and there's about a dozen presenters that will be talking about various aspects of contracting over 2 days. Two of them have agreed to speak today, and they'll be giving a very quick presentation. And the reason for that is we're allotting a significant amount of time on the back end for you to have some meaningful question and answer with both Bruce and Richard. So I don't want to take up any more time right now. I'm going to flip the presentation over to them. Guys, I'll turn off my camera, have a good presentation, and I'll be popping in at the end.
Good morning. My name is Richard Venerus, and I have a business by the name of Venerus Advisory Partners, where we specialize in collaboration, bringing collaboration to projects, mostly in this conversation. And then part of how our approach is in this area of contracts. And contracts often have an adversarial characteristic to them, and so collaboration in this area, this functional area or discipline, is an interesting and unique development. So that's why we're focusing on it. So our agenda today is, first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about contract strategy, and just as a setup for the conversation for the options that you have amongst different methodologies of contracting, and then we'll get into collaborative contracting generally, and then we'll get into specific forms of collaborative contracting that are out there, two of which are the integrated project delivery model for industrial projects, which is I2PD, or pronounced I2PD, and then an earlier form that's related but different, called alliance partnering, which has been used all over the world. So that's our agenda for today. If you have questions, there's a chat box. We'll try to maintain a finger on the pulse of questions to help you, but mostly we're going to answer questions live at the end. So a little bit of background about myself. Venerus Advisory Partners. We first started off as a sort of more traditional contracting supply chain business, doing in construction in particular, doing claims and contract management, things like that. And then eventually morphed into an organization that focuses on implementing something called ISO 44001, which is a standard for collaborative working that came out of the UK, or well, quite a while ago, actually, in the early 2000s. And so we're a driving force for implementing that here in North America and Canada, where I'm located in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And in connection with this, we've also started something called the Collaborative Contracting Community, which is designed to bring people with an interest in contracting collaboratively or collaborative project delivery together in one place to share, very much like the advanced work packaging community that Lloyd has set up through ASI. So with that introduction, I will let Bruce introduce himself, if that's all right, Bruce. Go ahead.
Yep, thank you. So my name is Bruce Burwell. I'm the partner of capital projects with PTAG. Prior to joining PTAG a couple of years ago, I spent the bulk of my career working for Ontario Hydro and Ontario Power Generation for almost 34 years. Many of those years in project management, portfolio management, construction management. And I implemented I2PD as a project delivery method back in 2018 in one of our projects, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. I am the chair of the CII I2PD research team. Prior to taking over the chair's position, I represented OPG on the research team, which started back in 2016, and we've moved into phase 2 of that research now. I also sit on a number of other CII committees, which you'll see listed here. So I'll turn it back to Richard. I'll be presenting I2PD and our case study and alliancing a little later on. Thank you.
Oh yeah, you're welcome, Bruce. Bruce and I are actually work together in some of these committees, so we know each other. And so we'd like to establish a context for this conversation. So there's this management methodology that's been around for a while about risk called VUCA, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And if you do a search on this, there's even Wikipedia articles, and it's something that's sort of been revived recently by the Harvard Business Review, and it's being studied. And basically, the idea behind it is that the world's getting more complicated. We have a number of trends that are rather quickly transforming how business is done, but also how we live. COVID's a great example. Pandemics have been long considered to be a risk, but people really didn't pay attention. But now we're paying attention to things like a pandemic, and I think very much after this pandemic is dealt with, you're going to see an altered state of reality, regardless of where you happen to be. And so things like that, these some people call them black swan events, but just usually, associated with market crashes or things like that, or collapses of a banking system. But we're going to see more and more of these things come right out of left field, and we're going to have to react. A number of other significant trends is the progression towards roboticization, automation, and what that does to the workforce, and how it changes the nature of work and how many jobs are out there for people to have, which is a concern for anybody who's really looking at the future. And also, there has been an absolute revolution in sustainability and in green technology, which has actually been very problematic, and will probably change the base of power, or geopolitical base of power in the world, away from the traditional oil-based economies. So there's all this change happening all the time, and it's constantly transforming our environment. And if you don't move fast, you get hit by the train. So the idea here is that in this VUCA world, with a lot of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, what do you do? What do you do to react? And our point of view is that a relatively inexpensive approach to responding to these both threats and opportunities is to respond with collaboration. And the idea here is to in a business context, really to maintain one's competitiveness in the face of all this. But you could also look at it as a way to deal with things at a human or a personal level. So we're proposing, given this VUCA world, responding with collaboration, finding ways to work together as opposed to competing with each other. Okay, so thank you very much, Steve. Look at that. He's advancing the slide very quickly without even me saying so. Okay, so switching completely away from that, within that context, you have contracts. Contracts are the basis of how people do business. It's very difficult, at least in a North American context anyway, to get any business done, without someone showing up and saying, please sign this contract. I need you to sign it, whether it's employment, whether it's a business partnership, whether it's a partnership with a supplier. You're always going to be faced with some kind of contracting activity. And the contracting activity is always creates all these binding obligations. And so obviously, before you get into these things, before you get your signed contracts or get into these binding obligations that kind of stick to you, if they're significant enough, it's wise in business to have a contracting strategy. And so our point of view here, for any of you out there that are doing contracts or that involve activity that requires contracts, is to have a strategic approach with respect to contracts. And what often happens is people fall into existing contracting and compensation models out there, and they don't really think about it. They just sort of say, well, I'll do this kind, most people just do it this way, I'll just do it this way. I'm not really gonna think about it. I just wanna get this contracting activity over with. It's painful. I don't really understand it. I just want to get it done. So, and many people skip over. It's a step that most people, and I should say most people, a lot of people overlook. And so really a contracting strategy is a deliverable. It's something oftentimes that you write down, like professional contracting or contracting professionals actually document something while going through specific contract strategy selection process. There's a lot of ways to do it, but the idea is that you should have it as a deliverable, assuming the work is significant enough to require it, and then you share it around, get opinions, stakeholder, and get people to buy into a particular strategy. If you can accomplish that, if you can get the deliverable, if you can get this consensus, and you'll see a small diagram here on the bottom here, so you have a number of inputs, some of them are about, that have to do with external environments, some of them are internal. You address those with the capabilities of the organization, which vary depending on resourcing and or the nature of the business, and then you generate a contracting strategy which implies a certain contractual arrangement. And that arrangement deals with scope and identified risks and specific outcomes, and then something called a compensation model, which is how we get paid for doing this scope and accepting this risk. And then that all gets documented into a specific arrangement. So why go through all this? Why do this? Why not just kind of skip over this, save some time, save some pain? And the idea is that this effort, the contracting strategy effort, actually tends to bring people into alignment because it raises issues that people care about but don't necessarily say anything about until you actually position it in front of them through a contracting strategy. So it tends to improve alignment amongst a variety of parties who actually likely have competing interests. It tends to lead to a more accurate definition of scope. It tends to result in more accurate compensation models and ones that motivate people to behave in ways that are beneficial for the scope or for each other. That can be a version of fairness, although fair is a very loaded word. It can definitely result in better risk management because it usually involves the discussion of risk, the identification and specific treatments for risk, and it can also improve the idea of either performance within the scope of a project or compliance if one believes that those two things are the same thing. Now, in traditional contracts, usually compliance with the contract is considered to be good performance. In collaborative contracting, we're focused more on the outcome, so we're going to get to that. And it can also improve the relationship experience because all this stuff that might normally remain hidden amongst the parties or between the parties comes out during the contract strategy discussions, either in a siloed way, both sides having these conversations internally, or through negotiations, or through a more open or honest or informed negotiation process, because both parties are coming forward with contract strategy. So they've been thinking about it. They come into the negotiation having thought about these issues, and so then the negotiation is arguably more productive as a result, and you end up with a better contract. So that's really the whole idea behind contract strategy, or doing contract strategy, the value behind contract strategy. And we're going to elaborate on this more greatly in the actual summit. So I'll end my discussion here around contracting strategy. So some of the traditional outputs of contracting strategy, and I want to say this specifically within a construction setting, if there are people on this call that aren't in the construction industry, then I'm sorry, but this particular spectrum here probably doesn't apply to you, and then it would be a different kind of spectrum. But it might look the same in the sense that on the left-hand side, the way we've set this up is that you have your more traditional models of contracting, and then on the right-hand side, you have what we would call the collaborative or relationship-based models of contracting. And then you'll see across the bottom this arrow that is sort of that powers the spectrum, so to speak, where you have the degree of collaboration in terms of how the parties are working together. That's sort of in the relationship, and then or at the project level, and then you have the level of shared risk, which usually involves specifically how risk is shared. Now, I want to be distinct here. It's sharing of risk, not allocation, and that's actually a significant distinction. So the idea here was the shared risk, and that's usually what's the word I'm looking for? Implemented through the compensation model in the contract. Okay, as well as things like terms, conditions around limitation liability, indemnity, warranty, all that stuff that lawyers typically address or are needed for. So going through this spectrum from left to right, again within construction, and you'll see here a bunch of models that you might be very familiar with. There's a design bid build model, which is probably the most traditional, with a lump sum or stipulated price. Lump sums used more in the industrial sector, stipulated price more in non-industrial construction like infrastructure or civil. And then often the most common, I would say, I don't have percentages here, but it could be as high as like 70–80%, is to bid the work out. If anybody's in the construction industry, they're probably, certainly anybody in business development, constantly tender, and certainly government procurement the world over, in many different languages, many different countries, people are responding to tenders. Okay, and so a tendering is a specific process, or what we call 3 bids and a buy, which is, a quote, a request for a quote. And basically the idea here is the focus is on price. The decision is made on price. Relationship's not necessarily all that important, although it can help. But the idea is if you're the lowest compliant bid, you win. And that's sort of that business model. And then as you progress to the right, you get a bit more of an openness. You'll see the procurement model across the bottom, more of an openness away from price-based decisions to best value, which now consider other factors associated or not so closely associated with price. And then in conjunction with that, you'll see the model start to change, the actual project delivery model change. So, the next column you have construction management, either agency or at risk with, kind of like a general contractor kind of scenario. And there you might have cost reimbursable or with a target price, or you might have lump sum. And then you get a bit more integration of these steps. So typically design, bid, build type models, you have your designer, you have your constructor, and then, you operate. So, and around this, the owner sort of dealing with both these parties in this kind of like V formation like that. And then later on, you get into models where the construction and design are a bit more integrated. And then sometimes, so that you're into design build or a lump sum turnkey EPC type scenario. And then some of those scenarios, the owner's a bit more involved. And then there is an approach here, and you can go and look it up on Wikipedia, called early contractor involvement, where the contractor and designer are actually brought together earlier at the design stage, maybe not in the front end entirely, but at the design stage, and where they work on constructability issues. So you have a little bit of collaboration happening here, where the constructor looks at the designer's work and says, this is my opinion. And then you'll have, and in design build, or lump sum, both these two functions are actually with the same entity. So, so you don't have the separation between design and construction quite so much. And then after that, you start to move into what we would call the collaborative models. And you'll see this notion of feed, or front-end engineering design, and open book. So this is where now people are actually starting to open up their financials. You're starting to get into, what's your margin? What are your costs? Some of it might get exposed, some of it might not get exposed. But the idea is now you're looking into more openness with respect to the financial side. And so that implies a conversation of risk and the value of contingency and how it's monetized, and then you might start getting into a different type of relationship sourcing now, where you're starting to source with relationships, meaning that you take your favorite suppliers, or your best performing suppliers, or the suppliers that you trust the most, and you start to have these conversations around pricing, or openness around pricing and cost and that sort of stuff. And then later on, as you move on from that, if you do more collaborative models, you might actually do some informal collaboration. You might have some facilitated teaming sessions where output might be a relationship charter. You might design outputs, whether it's a planning output or a design output, with a consensus or as a group in a facilitated setting. And so now you're starting to get more informal type of collaboration. And then on the right-hand side, you get what I would call systemic collaboration, where you have specific project delivery models or specific contracting models that incorporate all of this stuff in this area of collaboration. And they have very specific approach that integrates the teams, but they do it from the beginning, right? From the beginning, the contract is specifically designed for collaboration and integration. The project delivery model is specifically designed for collaboration and integration. And so you get this fully collaborative system that forms within the project, or around the program, where everything's highly relationship based. Okay, so that's the spectrum. I went on for a while there, but I wanted to take everybody through that. So what is, and so there's this definition, or this word called collaborative contracting. And if you type it in, you'll get tons of hits in Google, collaborative contracting, all over the place, all over the world. So we wanted to provide a definition. There's more than one, but for this conversation, we'll have this one definition. So basically, it's at least the way we like to frame it, it's an innovative and positive alternative to conventional contracting models. And the reason I say that is that most conventional contracting models tend to be highly reliant, or creatures of an adversarial legal system, where people basically sue each other if they're unhappy, or they'll go to arbitration, which is basically the same as litigation, but you have a private judge. But most conflict is solved like this. Okay, and so you have these collaborative contracting models where actually this happens much less often. And these models have been proven on multiple occasions to have a much lower incidence of claims, a much lower incidence of litigation, and then all sorts of better forms of performance. Because when people are working together, just like the old adage, two heads are better than one, or three or four, is that you get better performance in schedule, you get better performance on cost, you get better performance on quality, all the things that matter typically in a construction project setting are better. Empirically, there's empirical evidence it's better under conventional, under collaborative contracting models, if you could just get people to work together. So these models are designed to get people to work together. And you get the 2 individuals, or you can get a group, and some of these are poly-party agreements where 5, 10, even 14 people are signing all the same agreement. So they're all signing up to more or less the same terms and conditions, or a set of terms and conditions that they join. So instead of having, if you can imagine a scenario where you have multiple contracts, a typical project, you have multiple contracts, you do this party, this party, and this party, and that party, and this party, and this party. And if you add up all the contracts, you got, half a dozen or a dozen contracts to administer. In a collaborative contracting setting, oftentimes everybody signs one agreement, or they're signing on to a smaller number of existing agreements. So you tend to actually have much less number of contracts, and in those contracts, you tend to have a much larger number of parties. And those parties agree to agree. So it's a binding obligation here. It's not airy-fairy collaboration stuff. It's binding obligation. They agree to have to rely on relationships of trust, to build relationships of trust, to work together collaboratively, to seek mutual gain for all the parties. So it's the tide lifts all boats and lowers all boats. If we all lose money together, or we all make money together, that sort of thing. And very specifically avoiding adversarial behaviors. And one of the most obvious and stark versions of this is a provision where you forbear litigation, which basically you promise not to sue each other, which is a big pill to swallow, typically, if you're in the legal department. So go ahead and advance the slide, Stephen. And so how are these collaborative models different? So, and there's many of them. And like I said, Bruce is going to talk about a couple of them, and then we have our Q&A, and so you can certainly ask more questions. And maybe you're online typing away in Google right now looking for these things. But the idea behind the collaborative versus traditional, we thought we should create some kind of a description of that compares the two. One, success in a traditional contracting model is that you do what the T's and C's say. There's a compliance department, you comply with the contract, you're a good supplier, you're a good partner, whatever, but you did what you said you were going to do in the contract. However, the definition of success for collaborative contract is what's best for the project, or what's the best outcome for the project, and is very much outcomes focused and not on compliance. It's focused on getting this thing built within a certain amount of time, with a certain schedule, a certain cost, and that's success. If we can do that, that's success. Not following the contract is success. The project organization typically that's set up by these collaborative models is integrated, meaning that people tend to work together. There's even this concept of a big room where everybody works together, like literally physically co-locating, which has obviously changed now due to COVID. But in a traditional model, you tend to have silos even within an organization, and then you have silos between organizations. And these silos are people are constantly having to hop in and out of these things, and everything's segregated, and it just makes it so much less efficient in project delivery. Decisions are in a collaborative context tend to make are distributed. Powers distributed. Decisions are made in a more integrated and consensus fashion through voting, things like that, and versus hierarchy, where you have sort of the deciders at each organization, which hopefully get along, making the decisions in a downward flow through the organization, and then you have all these connect points through the silos. Communications, the information that's shared is more networked. It flows. There's more transparency, in particular around costs. In traditional methods, you tend to have more channels of communication, and things tend to be more hidden, and what's released tends to be more controlled. In the collaborative methods, risk is shared and balanced. When I see risk is shared, is that people will go through the effort of identifying all the risks. They'll measure some contingency or the value of each of these risks, to the extent they have the capability to do it. Sometimes you need to get into scenario modeling. You need computers for that. But the idea is you identify them all, and then you share them. Where in the risk, in a traditional model, usually the party with the amount of power says, "Here's a bunch of risk, you take it, and please don't charge me for that, because otherwise you don't win the bid." So because your price is going to be too high. So the treatment of risk is much higher, and the contract provisions in collaborative tend to be more enabling, meaning that they help people get the contract done rather than prescriptive, which actually prevents a whole bunch of behaviors. It's what's called a negative covenant. And then lastly, the experience, which is the most important thing, which is what we feel is the most valuable part about this at the human level, is collaborative contracts tend to be more relationship-based. People enjoy working together, and there tends to be less conflict and it's less adversarial, where competition in the traditional methods, competition and adversarialism tend to be triumphant over relationships or really anything else. So that's at a high level what collaborative contracts are and what's the differences among them. I believe that's my last slide. So at this point now, Bruce is going to talk about a specific model called I2PD, or Integrated Project Delivery. Go ahead, Bruce.
Okay, so, and I'll try to run through these slides rather quickly to allow time for our questions and answer period. So what's I2PD? I2PD is Industrial Integrated Project Delivery. It's a delivery method that fundamentally enhances project collaboration and integration. It's an outcome-focused delivery method incorporating high levels of collaboration and integration amongst the project participants, which could include the owner, designer, or contractors, equipment suppliers, consultants, and so on. The delivery method is viewed as relational contracting versus transactional in the traditional delivery methods that Richard talked about, with the appropriate sharing of project risk amongst all the stakeholders. As collaboration and integration and communication are increased within this approach, trust amongst the project participants is also enhanced. I2PD is more collaborative decision-making process focused on what's best for project versus traditionally, as opposed to what's best for me or what's best for my organization. With the aim of improving performance, quality, safety, early cost and schedule certainty, and optimize design of the product, facility, etc. Okay. So what's the history of I2PD? Alliancing started in the oil and gas industry in the North Sea in the early 1990s as a contracting approach to share project risks. Alliancing migrated then to Australia and New Zealand and has become the preferred project method of delivery for civil infrastructure projects. Commercial IPD originated about 20 years ago, mainly in the healthcare facilities, but has been used widely in the commercial space. But IPD has been not used extensively within the industrial sector. Commercial IPD has a heavy emphasis on collaboration to enhance design, higher quality facilities faster with no significant cost increase, and of course higher owners' satisfaction. Infrastructure and alliancing, it has a heavy emphasis on integration, and within that integration, it mitigates construction risk. So what I2PD does, it balances the 9 principles taken from commercial IPD and alliancing, and to promote collaboration and integration of work processes and systems. And then on top of those 9 principles, there's a number of methods that are applied, mainly from the lean sector, which I'll talk about in a bit as well. The contracting element is based on what's best for project, and you'll hear this a lot, and not what's best for the individual contracting party. It aligns the objectives and incentives based on project performance. Multiple stakeholders, but one single objective, and that's the project. Full transparency of costs, fully open book amongst all of the parties, and a balanced risk-rewards scheme. The process, it employs early collaboration and alignment of the business interests of the key participants. You're designing to budget and conditions versus traditionally where you mainly conduct your design, finalize your design, and then you put your design out on the street to receive your proposals. Okay. And it applies many of the lean tools and techniques such as pull planning, integrated estimates and scheduling, front-end planning, utilizing big rooms, etc. Behaviors. In my mind, behaviors is the vitally important and the most important. It's a one-team approach, working across company lines in a highly collaborative and integrative team. Open communication, open collaboration, a flat organization with equitable decision-making. You want to drive down the decision-making process to the lowest possible level within this type of delivery method. Okay? And cross-functional groups tailored to the project goals. Okay? Next slide, please. So back in 2018, like I mentioned, I implemented I2PD as a contracting strategy or a project delivery method within OPG. It was an 8-unit hydroelectric generator overhaul, executing 1 unit overhaul per year, and that's what this case study is about. So where do you begin? You begin early in the project life cycle. You know, prior to scope development or at scope development, coming out of project identification. That's where you begin, and that's where you engage your I2PD team. Early involvement will significantly speed up scoping and early estimate phases, aligning the goals of the team and the owner's desired business case for the project. Your procurement phase, you want to select contractors and contractor teams that drive innovation, that'll work collaboratively together, reduce risks, and take advantage of schedule and cost opportunities. The right project team will deliver critical input into the validation phase, insightful risk analysis, and the application of the appropriate lean construction techniques, removing duplication, you know, and reducing waste, and so on. A contractor must be efficient in the use of his resources throughout all phases of the project in order to keep the costs in line with the expectations that are set out at the onset. Examples of milestones during the procurement phase is request for qualifications. Are your contracting parties, equipment suppliers, are they even interested in this type of project delivery method? You might have them respond to requests for qualifications. You may want to conduct some interviews during these requests for qualifications. You know, not all organizations are suited for this type of contracting model. They need the right culture to work collaboratively, and not all of our contracting friends, they may be very, very good contractors that you have long-standing relationships with, but the culture within that organization may not be fitted for this model. Then you're going to issue your RFP. Okay, you'll solicit some proposals. The scoring process, you know, is vitally important. That leads to the selection of your set of suppliers, contractors to execute the work. And I use Alan Shepard's quote. You know, it's very sombering feeling to be up in space and realize that one's safety factor was determined by the lowest bidder of a government contract. You know, that may or may not be the case for your particular IPD project. You may not be selecting the lowest bidder at this stage of the process. Okay. And then you're going to have your proponents conduct presentations for the evaluation team. You know, again, the interviews are a critical aspect in the selection of the project team. It's not just checking off a ticky box and checking off points in the scorecard, but it's ensuring that the contracting team has the right mindset and the way that they'll work collaboratively, and to change and to bust out of that traditional mindset for this type of delivery model. You'll select a collaborative team of contractors that fully understands this methodology and the spirit of integrated project delivery within this model. It's critical that you select the right team with the right mindset early on at this stage of the project. So now you've selected your team, you're moving into what we call the validation phase. You'll have a kickoff meeting, you'll set up a big room. It may or may not be at site, it doesn't have to be at site. You conduct some activities, maybe do a maturity model, lay out the activities throughout the validation phase and the expected values. Okay. You'll do a detailed scope review, a detailed schedule reviews, and then you'll start to assemble your integrated schedule. Same for estimate. You'll pick apart the estimate and you'll roll up a single integrated estimate. And same with risks. All the risks will be identified, and the risks then will be integrated into one integrated risk plan. And then you'll conduct your contract reviews, your multi-party agreement that all of the stakeholders are going to sign on to. The output of that validation study will be an agreed to design, schedule, cost, risk in one single report that will be signed not just by the contractors and the parties, but the owner as well. Okay. And then we'll be held accountable for hitting those targets throughout the remainder of the project lifecycle. Moving into construction phase, again, you'll have a kickoff meeting in a big room. Again, the big room may or may not be on site. It could be off site. It could be virtually, like we're working through, since March of last year. It is proven that we're working in a virtual setting is actually beneficial, reducing costs, associated with travel, hotels, etc. You'll do your detailed design reviews and any enhancements, your constructability reviews, value stream mapping, 3D modeling, BIM modeling, identifying clash points, etc. Your construction plan and your sequencing of construction will be finalized. Your project management plan, how are you going to report? What systems are you going to be using as one system for reporting in your document management plan? Schedules will be tightened up, estimates will be tightened up, and your procurement plan will be identified. Okay. Who's best to procure what pieces of equipment? And the output during that phase, you'll have your finalized project execution plan, your final cost estimate, and your level 5 schedule. Then moving into construction. Okay, now you're going to execute the work. Okay, so you probably will move your big room to site. You'll have a kickoff meeting. You may have some environmental reviews to conduct, community or stakeholder reviews, traffic, noise, road closures, this sort of thing, site logistics, scheduling within the site. You may be executing this work, as we are with this case study, with a generator running right beside you. So you'll be executing the work, and the place or the facility is still in operational mode. Okay. Progress meetings, your payment certificates, how you're going to review those monthly progress payments, any change requests, There's still a process for change within this type of model, whether it's change driven from the owner or whether it's change for, what we call known unknowns. Quality inspection reviews, construction work planning, your pull planning, your look aheads, 1, 2, 6 week look aheads, and then your uncertainty management. Are you hunting for opportunities, and are you conducting your threat reviews? Okay. Some of the lessons, okay, it does require upfront planning, extensive planning required at the start of the project. But the time and effort expensed for this upfront plan, you'll realize those benefits of that planning at the back end of the project. It's shifting internal and external mindsets from traditional mindset to a mindset of a one team approach. Okay? Senior management commitment to provide adequate resources. You don't need your A team or your B team, but you do need adequate resources to integrated systems, one integrated system to be decided by the core team, whether it's the owner's system or whether it's one of the contractors or supplier systems, but there'll be one integrated system, again, to reduce and remove duplications and finding the most efficient means and ways to execute this work. Okay? And you may want to incentivize the contractors during the validation and pre-construction phases, and not just during the construction phase. And you must have a willingness to replace poor performing participants quickly. If one individual, or even one organization is underperforming, or let's say not playing well in the sandbox, they'll have to be replaced. And that was one of the big lessons that was identified to us back in 2017 when we were considering I2PD. If you have an individual that does not have the right mindset on your team, and I'm talking about the owner's team now in particular, remove them quickly. And I had to do that. Okay. And the big room, it's high importance of utilizing that big room and having all of the I2PD team or your project team within that big room, dedicated to the project. Next slide, please, Stephen.
So, Bruce, I think we need to skip over alliancing and partnering so we have time for question and answer. So I'm going to stop the presentation right now. We were on the last slide, so it's not really cutting off much. And I just wanted to provide a little bit of information on the summit that's coming up, and then I'll switch over to Q&A. So Steve, could you bring up? Perfect. So the virtual summit that we're talking about is going to be coming up this April. And next slide, please, Steve. It's going to be the 28th and the 29th. And skip down 2 slides, please, Steve. Our summit, we're going to have a team from CII representing their leadership team. Jay's from Shell, Jamie, Exxon, Eric is the head of the Community for Business Advancement for AWP. Annabella's the head of the Community for Business Advancement for Supply Chain. So we've got some real talent from CII that are going to be part of this team. And then the next slide, Steve. We also have, as our subject matter experts, people from Exxon, Richard and Bruce. We've also got Phil, who's a professor We've got Michael, who's senior with PTAG. We've got Allison, who's with OPG, and we've just added another presenter who's from Shell, who has global responsibility for supply chain. So we've got some real talent putting the presentation on. Next slide, please, Steve. First day of the agenda. Perfect. So our first day is all about traditional contracting. What are the options? What are the benefits, the risks? When should you use what? And then the second day, Steve, is where we're looking at collaborative contracting. And we're going to be looking at what are the range of options available for you? What's IPD? What's alliancing and partnering? What are their strengths? When do you use them? So over the 2 days, you're going to get a real good understanding of what the options are and how to build out your toolkit. So this is a CII event, and I don't want to take up any more time. I want to jump into Q&A for Bruce and Richard. And one of the first questions that I've got here, and I'll ask it and you can decide who wants to respond to it. But the question is, collaborative contracting requires relationships, trust, and matured project management ability. How do we start?
Bruce, I can take a quick stab at this. There's some questions here that I think might be specific to the I2PD model, in particular what's happening in the feed stage. So maybe you could address some of those. This one's a bit more general. Yes, it does require all of these things. These are what I would call capabilities or assets that can be developed by either party within the scope of the relationship. To some extent, these will exist in an organization. The ability to, good relationships with trust, and a mature project management capability will exist in areas within an organization. If you have them all in the same area, then it should be easy to do collaborative work. But oftentimes they have to be built. And so you have to build, relationships need to be built, trust needs to be built. And so if you have a purposeful approach towards having good relationships within a project context or between project parties, if you work at trust as an objective and you work at building trust over time, and then you could build that into your project management capability. But that requires a decision to be made to do that, often starting from leadership, and then some particular way of doing that, whether it's formal or informal, then being progressed down through the organization and then applied to projects. So it takes some time to build and then apply that approach. I hope that answers the question. How about some of the questions around feed here that were asked specifically that I think maybe Bruce can answer within the context of I2PD?
Sure, what's the question?
So one question is, what are the minimum requirements that need to be incorporated into the feed deliverables at the feed stage? Again, feed front-end engineering design stage of project development. I'm assuming that means if you're going to do collaborative work.
Yeah, Bruce, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, sure. And I'll back it up just a little bit prior to that. First of all, you got to select the appropriate project for this type of delivery method. We're not saying, I'm not saying I2PD is the most appropriate contracting strategy or delivery method for every project. Definitely not. It's intended for high-risk projects. It's intended for projects with multiple stakeholders, and it's intended for projects that have a significant dollar value, and they're prepared to expense that front end planning, which I talked about earlier, with the benefit of certainty or even cost and schedule reductions at the back end. Okay, so the feed exercise, it started during validation phase, where there is a percentage of engineering that needs to be completed during the validation phase in order for you to identify schedule, integrated schedule, risk plan, integrated estimates as well. But the final details of the feed will be conducted during that pre-construction exercise. So that's the whole intent of putting together your your I2PD team. You're bringing contractors to the table, sitting alongside with the engineering teams. So they're providing constructability input into the design, and that commences during the validation phase.
Great, thank you. So one final question, because I think that's all we have time for, is what kind of gains have the two of you seen in terms of the benefits that can be achieved through collaborative contracting? You talked about less legal consequences, but what are some of the other practical benefits that you've seen through effective use of collaborative contracting? And let's start with Bruce and then go to Richard.
I can share a couple of survey results, and then with our case study as well. So alliancing has identified schedule reductions of 7%, and that's based on 300 plus alliances, and a cost reduction of 3.5% based on those same samplings. But with our case study, we realized when we went out on the street, we issued just our traditional specifications, and we asked for fixed price proposals from our proponents. Okay, so we had that in our hand. Once we selected the team and we entered into the validation phase, coming out of the validation phase, we saw a 32% reduction in cost and a 35% reduction in schedule. Okay? Now those are big numbers. Are you going to realize those savings with every project? Absolutely not. But the benefit of having an integrated risk plan, an integrated schedule, detailed scope reviews, and your integrated estimate, removing all the layers of duplication and inefficiencies, you will realize a significant either savings in cost and schedule. But the importance here is you're providing early cost and schedule certainty for the owners and for the contractors as well. You coming out of the validation phase and right through to execution, the validation phase will identify to the owner, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to achieve it. So the owner gets the cost and schedule certainty.
Great, and I apologize, but we're at the top of the hour, and so any questions that weren't answered, we'll try and reach back to you with comments from our presenters. I want to thank Richard and Bruce for giving us some great information, and I want to thank all of you for attending today. So really appreciate it, and we'll end the webinar on time. So thank you.
Our pleasure.
Thank you all.